All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This event is a Menard Family Initiative event. I'm Adam Stivers from the Finance Department. I'm the co-director of the Menard Family Initiative. This event today is, in addition to being sponsored by the Menard family and their continued support, it's also brought to you by the Institute for Humane Studies, or IHS, from George Mason University. And it's part of their educational entrepreneurship series, in particular with an emphasis on the 250th anniversary of the US. So that's sort of the theme of the talk we'll have today. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. So we have Dr. Scott Miller, who earned his BA from Vanguard University of Southern California, followed by an MA from George Mason University and a PhD in history from the University of Virginia. He also completed a postdoctoral fellowship in economic and business history at the Yale School of Management International Center for Finance. He is currently an economic historian at the Darden School of Business and the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. So thank you, Scott, for being here. I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Sufficient hearing. Great. All right. Perfect. Well, thank you all for coming. You never quite know how many people are going to come to these types of things on a Friday. So thank you. It's been a pleasure and honor to be here. What I want to talk to you today is about the origins of the American economic system. All right. We'll talk a little bit in detail, but many of you, if not most of you, are Americans. You are party to this wonderful lineage of the American economy and what it's become. But the problem that I tend to run into, and this is the case in the general public and as well as with scholars, is that there tends to be like this image of like the American economy is like the world's loan, and now we're kind of bridging into a new world where there's a couple superpowers again. But the American economic superpower is a thing that has always existed. And essentially, I hear this all the time. This is a story that was on a glide path from the very beginning, right? It's very, very natural. We have lots of land. We have lots of resources. We have two massive moats that surround us and protect us from the world. So yeah, of course, it's like it's predestined, essentially. And what's interesting about that is as I kind of heard people kind of saying this, I was like, well, nothing's predestined. That doesn't make any sense. And so as I think about this, how many of you have taken, will take, or are anyway interested in like developmental economics? Okay. The idea of how economic systems kind of grow from low levels of complexity to lots of complexity and lots of wealth. Like that is in the end the story that we're going to talk about today. And it's because there is the assumption, the fundamental assumption, that the American economy was always on a glide path. It was always going to happen. And so what's interesting is this isn't just us who have thought this. This isn't just modern people who have assumed this. It was Americans during the American Revolution who thought this as well. So this is a cartoon that was published widely in 1782. So this is before, for those of you a little fuzzy on the timelines, this is before the revolution is actually even done. And so what you see here is this basic idea, right? You have America represented by Minerva over here on the right, and Britain with, of course, the devil over her shoulder over here on the left. And as soon as we get out from under those pesky Brits, like all the ships from everybody else in the world will want to come to us, like take possession of the bounty. There will be angels blowing trumpets, et cetera, et cetera. All we have to do is kind of break this imperial mold, and it's predestined. Right? The problem with this is that is not what we know happens after colonial breakages, right? Think about a lot of developing economies today. They are the products of post-colonial breakages, right? And so we just know by looking at a lot of countries, you can like look at Argentina as a perfect example, lots of land, lots of resources, and they've struggled profoundly for a good number of years. And so the question that we want to talk about is like, well, if America didn't have this predestined glide path to economic superpowerdom, like how did that actually happen? And we're going to look at it through the lens of developmental economics and just try to understand this on the course. So what I want to talk to you about, obviously, is how the American economy became American. And when I say this, I mean it very precisely as opposed to colonial and British. Because like, it is not one glide path from one to the other. This idea of independence is something that's very important. So this is, actually, I did this a couple of years ago using ChatGPT, so I should do it again. It's gotten much better. But what I did is I wanted to understand how Americans kind of thought about this. So I went to newspapers from 1778, so not quite 250, right? 248. 248 years ago, and I wanted to understand how Americans thought about this. So I took newspaper accounts of all these celebrations of the 4th of July, and I fed them into ChatGPT, and it said, create for me an image that kind of captures the spirit of this. And this is what it came up with. And this isn't bad. It's a little like extreme, but okay. But one of the things as I was reading through these newspaper accounts is there was a lot of kind of regional divergence to these celebrations, but there was one thing that everybody did, which will fit with some of the talks we had yesterday, is everybody was always toasting and they were drinking, okay? All over the place. The amount that these people drank was disturbing, okay? But they were always toasting, always toasting, always toasting. But what was interesting is I put in more than 15 accounts, regardless of whether it was from Maine to Georgia. There was some regional variation in what they toasted to, but there were always 3 main things that they toasted to. One was to George Washington. That's fair. I love George Washington, father of the country. We wouldn't have existed without him. Fair enough. The second was to France or to friendly European powers, okay? Because without the French, we wouldn't have our independence. Sorry, everybody. But the third thing, and this was ubiquitous, over and 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 over again, the thing they toasted to was American independence. Using that word. They didn't toast to freedom. They didn't toast to liberty. They toasted to American independence or American independency. Across states or colonies at that point. And so like, I want to outline this dichotomy. Like they use that word independence not as a synonym for anything else. They meant it very, very specifically. And so I want to draw this contrast between dependence and independence, because that's what they were celebrating. Their independence. They're no longer dependents from Britain. And so in order to understand why this is important, you have to understand that the American colonies were a colonial economic system. Like, what is a colonial economic system? This is largely the case from the North American colonies to Kenya, to India, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America. All follows a very similar model. The model tends to be, you pull stuff out of the ground, you send it far away to the imperial center. People in the imperial center process it and turn it into something much more expensive, and then they sell it back to the colonized people for a much higher price. That is colonial economic systems, period. This was the system that the American colonists were under during the entire colonial period in the United States. Colonial should not just mean to us the period before the Revolution. It's something very specific. And so colonial systems are based on 2 main things. The first is monopolies, right? Monopolies of trade, monopolies of finance, and monopolies of industry. Okay? And the second thing they're largely based on is resource extraction and exploitation. So what that means, again, you pull stuff out of the ground, you export it to somewhere far away. But the important thing that's involved here is you aren't just able to pull stuff out of the ground and send it far away wherever you want. You have to send it far away to a place the imperial center tells you to send it, right? So it's a captured market. Right? So the important thing to note here is that these colonial economic systems are systems of developmental stasis, meaning that if you are the imperial core, if you're the metropole, if you're parliament, you do not want those pesky Americans becoming anything higher up the value chain than people who pull stuff out of the ground and send it to you. The moment they start kind of producing things and moving up the value chain, they start competing with British imperial producers. And that's exactly what you don't want them to do. So the point of colonial policy is to have developmental stasis on a very, very low level. And you want them to be structurally and fundamentally dependent on the empire. So in case you're thinking this is just like this guy in a suit standing up here telling you this, this is a quote from a guy named James Abercrombie. He was the commander-in-chief, the British commander-in-chief in the American colonies in the 1750s. And this is what he said in a letter back to Parliament. He said, "It must be our policy that the dependency of these colonies and plantations on this kingdom may be firm and permanent, so as to render the strength and the wealth of these American provinces subservient and conducive to the general and particular interests of this nation." So there he is saying it in black and white. It should be our policy goal to make sure the Americans remain dependent upon us. That is the operating principle of everything we do. And they did it quite well in many cases. So the question is, how then? I can tell you that it did, but the question I always ask my students, how questions, why questions? What questions tend to be quite boring? So the how questions. How did the British create dependence in America? It's easy to say that they did, but the question of how they did it is very important. So the first way they did this is to prevent the development of like a domestic or like an internal economy amongst the Americans. Now, they're still colonies at this point, and as we will see, they were very, very fractured and quite frankly hated each other. So to call it American domestic economy is a bit of an anachronism, but we're going to use it for this case. But the whole point is that you don't want the Americans to come together and form something that's cohesive, because together they'll be able to challenge Britain and the metropole. So the whole goal is to suppress kind of a domestic economy. You hear this all the time when you're referring to China. Well, China's big problem right now is they're export dependent. What they need to do is boost internal consumption, right? You hear this in every second New York Times article, okay? So like that is what the British are trying to suppress. And they're trying to suppress internal or domestic systems of trade, finance, or industry, okay? And to do so, they create something that I call the ecology of dependence. And so like what ecology is, or laboratory ecology, do we have anybody in like the hard sciences here? I wouldn't expect this. Oh, what hard science? Oh, chemistry, okay, forget it. Okay, I was hoping ecology, sometimes it works, rarely it does. Anyway, so laboratory ecology, and pay attention to this definition. It says it is the scientific organization of interactions between organisms and their environment. So engineered interactions between organisms and their environment. That is exactly what the British imperial powers are trying to do in America. And they're trying to create systems of incentives and deterrence, not prohibitions per se. How many of you, if your parents tell you flat out, you do not, cannot, must not do something, how many of you are going to try to do it anyway? Oh, come on, please. Okay. That is the point. The British imperial powers knew this. They knew if they just flatly told the Americans, you try to do something that we don't want you to do, we will, raze your towns and burn your houses and whatever. Just like petulant teenagers, they knew the Americans would be like, we're going to do it anyway. So what they tried to do was create a system of incentives where Americans would choose to remain dependent, right? So the question then becomes, how do they do this? Well, what you do if you're British, I'm going to put on my wig or something right now. you raise the cost of independence and you reduce the cost of dependence in the hope that Americans will then make the calculus and be like, at least in the short term, like it's better to be dependent. So they'll choose it themselves as opposed to it being forced on them. So the question then is, how do British imperial policymakers do this? They do it, as any good parent would, through a combination of carrots and sticks. So I want to lay these out very quickly. First is, we're talking about carrots first, because that's nicer, I suppose. Americans have market access in the British imperial empire, the British imperial commercial system, right? That is not guaranteed. This is not a free trade world. So Americans have access to markets in Britain and in the West Indies. That's not nothing. The second is the exact inverse of that, is they have protection against foreign competition. So you're in the imperial commercial system. If you're a indigo farmer in South Carolina, you do not have to compete against indigo producers in France. Great deal, okay? So you're in the system, you're protected against outside competition, you have the security of the Royal Navy, which is a big deal because you've all seen like Pirates of the Caribbean or something like that. That was a very real concern. But even more, if we're looking at this in an economic way, like it costs a lot to defend yourself. And so if you don't have to defend yourself, if you have the Royal Navy doing that for you, you can just internalize those cost savings. And then there is a massive program of what we would call fiscal subsidies for the Americans. The British government and Parliament in particular lavished all kinds of subsidies and bounties and drawbacks and all of these incentives on the American colonies to get them to behave a certain way. And so, like, the benefits, as you see, are starting to add up here. Like, the carrots are like, okay, yeah, maybe we would like to be independent in a perfect world, but, like, we're getting kind of a sweet deal here. They have, like, funny accents, and they're annoying, but, like, fine, okay? And then because I'm in the finance unit at Darden, this is, you know, I think this is more important than anything else, but they had ridiculously cheap credit, funneled through British merchants and bankers from the Royal Treasury and the Bank of England. So the cost of credit that they were using, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, was artificially dramatically reduced. So you have all these kind of carrots and incentives for the Americans to remain dependent, even though independence might be better, and they are intentionally suppressing this kind of American economy and being like, much better to have the connections elsewhere in the empire. 6, this is the fun stuff, great, okay. So they made internal market connection intentionally difficult. So if you were to try to transit goods from one American city to another, you would have a terrible time intentionally. This is probably one of my favorite quotes. It's from a guy named Isaac Weld, who was a Brit, who was touring around America at the very end of the Revolution and immediately after. And he said, "The road from Philadelphia to Baltimore exhibits for the greater part of the way an aspect of savage desolation." I actually have students from both Baltimore and Philly, and they joke that, like, yeah, that's what it's like now, so maybe it hasn't changed that much. But, you know, with chasms at a depth of 6, 8, or 10 feet at numerous intervals. So what he's essentially saying is, like, maybe if you're a guy on a horse, you'll be able to go from Philly to Baltimore. But, like, if you're trying to trade in any volume over these roads between two of the biggest cities in America, like, good freaking luck. That's just not going to happen. So that's inherent isolation that is taking place because the links between the two places is intentionally difficult. I'm not going to go into the details, but the way the British did this is they devolved road making and infrastructure authority to the very lowest level possible. So you had, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a wonderful place. You should all visit at some point. Richmond, Virginia is about an hour away by car. in order to make a road to trade from Charlottesville to Richmond, there were about 200 separate people with different incentives and different interests having a decision about that process. It virtually never happened. And that was intentional British imperial policy to devolve that decision-making to the lowest level. And the reason we know that is because it was the exact opposite on the British home island. The local people had absolutely no say in this whatsoever, okay? So direct inverse of how this worked. But the point is, it made trading between different American places incredibly difficult. The second is that Americans had an interesting, shall we say, habit of enacting tariffs and trade barriers against each other. So Rhode Island had trade barriers and tariffs against Massachusetts. Massachusetts would have them against Connecticut. Connecticut would have them against New York. New York would have them against Philly or Pennsylvania, and so on and so on and so forth. So they're creating trade barriers against each other. So we're using the word like an American market. You should be starting to see that there is no Americanness about this at all. Interestingly enough, though, while it's perfectly fine if the Americans set up trade barriers against each other, it is illegal and prohibited to have trade barriers for goods coming in from the UK or Great Britain. So Americans can fragment against each other all they want, but absolutely no barriers whatsoever for goods to and from Britain itself. So again, that sets up frictions for integration and connection between the Americans, but like it smooths the way for connection with either the West Indies or the British home island in particular. There is the prevention of internal transfers of resources. So for example, there are significant iron deposits in Rhode Island, but they don't have any coal. You need coal to make iron and steel because you got to go warm up the furnaces. You have that in Pennsylvania. The problem is the Brits decided that you cannot transfer coal from Pennsylvania to Rhode Island. And so the point is that like this internal transfer of resource, things that we just take for granted now, was statutorily illegitimate. 5, we're going to keep going here for the sake of it. Discouragement of domestic production. There were specific laws saying that you could not make in America the types of goods that British merchants traded. So you absolutely could not have competition with British produced goods. And again, because finance is really cool, financial repression. What this essentially meant is you could not have banks in the American colonies by law, and they significantly limited the money supply, except for very limited instances in times of war. So if you don't have banks and you can't do any money and you were reliant on the British Empire for your money, that means you are fundamentally dependent on British centers of finance. If you're reliant on somebody for finance, there's a dependency factor growing there. Okay, so the question I get all the time is, well, what about smuggling? There's actually been a lot of books written over the last 10 years or so about smuggling, some of them very good, some of them less so. And yes, Americans smuggled, absolutely. But going with our, like the Brits weren't trying to prohibit us from doing something, this is super important. We did smuggle a lot, but the point of British policy was to raise the cost of non-imperial trade, of smuggling. And smuggling is very expensive. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, if you're smuggling, you have to spend more days at sea because you're taking circuitous routes. You are paying bribes to local collectors. There's breakage or the seizures of your ship sometimes that you have to factor into your cost structure. The freight rates, the rentals of the ships are much higher because it's illegal and you have to compensate for that risk. The labor premium was sky high, so captains and crew were like, well, if we're going to do something that's going to potentially get us in trouble, you're going to pay us a whole heck of a lot more. And then in addition to that, there was an entire market in America for insurance for smuggled shipping, entire market for this, and the rates were much higher, put it that way. So the whole point is that the average, and on the low end, the average cost of smuggled voyages was 30 to 40% higher than legal shipping. So Americans did, when they saw it within their interest, smuggle. But if you're looking at a 30 to 40% minimum cost premium, the incentive is most of the time you're going to stay within the legal system. Not because the Brits don't want you to, but because it's just way more expensive and not cost effective. Again, Americans are choosing their isolation and their dependence. Okay? So then what changes? Well, the 7 Years' War, or as we sometimes call it, the French and Indian War, was what really changed the game. The Brits had spent 150 years fragmenting and isolating the Americans from each other, and they hated each other. You should hear George Washington talk about people from New England. It's hilarious. He hated them. Okay. And vice versa too, by the way. But what happens when you fight a continental or a global war? A lot of people refer to the 7 Years' War as the first World War, not the one in 1914. If you are fighting a continental war against the French in North America, having a bunch of fragmented like colonies that can't work together is not the best way to defeat the French, and we always want to defeat the French. I actually like the French more than the Brits, but that's nonetheless. So like the 7 Years' War, the Brits like enact a series of policies to be like, okay, like for the sake of the war effort, we need to work together. You need to start taking down some of these barriers and whatever, try to integrate this together because it's the only way we can defeat the French, as we must. And so what's interesting about this is because this starts working, actually, as Americans begin to see how vulnerable they really will be if they have to go back to the status quo ante, the system before where they were just fractured from each other, like, ooh, this may not be great. And at the same time, they realize that maybe if they don't have that fragmentation mandated, they may be able to make a system that actually works for them because it's working during the war. So this is the situation they find themselves in, and this is, I'm a very nerdy, very boring person, but I think that this is super cool. This is probably one of the best charts I found in my entire research for this project. What you're seeing here is in the years immediately after the 7 Years' War, you see trade with the other 13 colonies go up by over 150%. And trade with the rest of the world is static. So what you're seeing is there's the 7 Years' War, Americans are incentivized to start working together, and then after that war, they're like, this is nice, we're going to keep doing this. And they continue to do this and continue to do this. And that is only supercharged by the revolution. We've all seen this, learned about this in elementary school, join or die, but Americans begin to see that if they continue to act this and they have the chance to begin to come together like this after the war is over and after independence is assured, we're going to be on a glide path to superpowerdom. It's great. Fantastic. The problem is that this transition, and we see this in development economics all the time, this transition from colonial dependence to independence is very, very, very fraught and very difficult to navigate. And the way I think about this is imagine like there's a lattice work, like people have, my grandparents had them in their backyard, and they have like vines or morning glories that like grow up this lattice work. And even though that these vines, like they kind of grow around each other, like they are fundamentally reliant on the lattice work. So the lattice work here is like the British imperial ecosystem. And so economic systems kind of grow and evolve to fit the structural constraints that they have to go on. And so imagine if you have this lattice work in your backyard completely covered with vines, and then magically you could snap your fingers and then just make the lattice work disappear. It's just going to start crumpling down to the floor because it is evolved around this structure. And then that structure is suddenly gone. That is what happens when dependent colonial systems suddenly become independent. And that's and that kind of crumbling is exactly what happened in the United States. So this is the Great Depression of the 1930s. zooming forward in time very briefly, basic chart of the Depression in the 1930s. We've all seen this, like soup lines, Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, yada, yada, yada. This line is the Depression of the 1780s, superimposed on top. So this red line is the years during and after the American Revolution. It's like nearly identical in trajectory. It's crazy. And so coming out of independence, where we are trying to set ourselves up as an independent power, we are trying to do that amidst the Great Depression of the 1930s, for all intents and purposes. Now, the question is, I wish I could spend more time on this. If you have questions, I would love to discuss this. I'm not going to go as quickly or as slowly as I would like, but this happens because of a collapse in the money supply. Remember, we are dependent upon Britain for finance and money. We no longer have access to that, and we have a collapse in the money supply. That leads to massive deflation. If you haven't learned in your econ classes, you will soon, hopefully. A lot of people, and we are genuinely concerned about inflation. If you talk about like central bankers, deflation is the thing that terrifies them. I was giving a talk at the US Treasury a year ago or something, and I showed this chart, and there was a central banker from a Nordic country, and I showed this chart, and I swear to God, this is exactly what he said, and kind of pardon this, but he said, "Holy shit, is that real?" And I was like, yeah. The idea that prices are falling here in this block, 6%, 3%, 8%, 8%, 6%, 11%, that is terrifying. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so the idea is there is this dichotomy set up by a Nobel Prize winner named Daron Acemoglu that essentially divides colonial systems into settler societies and extractive societies. And he tends to like push colonial systems into one or the other. My premise here is that doesn't apply in the real world, is you can have both. You can have settler societies that are incredibly and remarkably extractive. And so trying to force them into this binary doesn't fit in like historical analysis. And so, yes, America was to a degree a settled society, but it was also, if you look at any of the evidence, it was remarkably extractive at the same time. So you get a lot of the same problems. Yeah. Yeah. So we have falling prices, deflation, you have a massive credit crunch, and you have massive bankruptcy and unemployment across the country in the 1780s, right? Okay. So the way we need to think about this is such. After the revolution, the United States is not a superpower in waiting. It is a resource-rich, admittedly, capital and labor poor, developing post-colonial economy. There are differences, like in terms of social structure to a certain degree, like we were just saying, but from a structural economic perspective, if you don't think about the United States economy after the revolution as anything other than a post-colonial developing economy, you will not understand what happened. So then the question again is, as I said before, what questions are boring? How and why questions? I asked a how question, here's a why question. Then why did the United States not end up a failed developing economy? Why? Why did we somehow escape? Other than the textbook answer you get as well, because. It is because, as I have talked about and bragged on, they began creating this domestic, integrated, independent economic system. And integrated is the word here, okay? So again, I showed this chart before. This is what was going on before the revolution. This actually stops during the Depression because colonial economic systems tend to, when they face stress situations, they go to what they know, which is completely and totally understandable. But they begin to pick it up again And the way they do this is to build this domestic economy, for lack of a better term. They need to begin to build the mechanisms and the infrastructure to actually have this. So there's a whole nother side to this, but if you're creating a links for like goods and human capital to travel, you're also building a unified nation as well. So there's an entire political dimension to this, which I don't have time to get into. But they start doing this by land first, or we'll talk about it first. And this is where it's very important, is like federal policy leads the way in this, right? The federal government in particular really leads the way in this. And I won't go through this in general or in detail, but there was something called the Post Office Act of 1792 that gave the federal government the right and the funds to build a network of roads, not just between states, which was the technical understanding of federalism, but also within them as well. So you start having a dense network of roads that aren't of savage desolation, like that quote before said. But if you can transit mail and communication and information on these roads, you can also transit goods and humans as well. So you start to have this weaving together of a dense American economic system by road, which is incredibly important if you're going to be trading between these former separated, isolated colonial economies. So in addition to building these larger networks, they start building infrastructure on a local level. And what I mean by this is it's really important to connect Philly to Baltimore, but if you're living out in a more rural area, it's equally important to connect little town to 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 little town. Like maybe Baltimore is important, but maybe what you need in order to do what you need to do is just a slightly bigger market that connections to 3 or 4 other smaller towns can provide you. That did not exist much in the colonial period, and local systems and state governments begin pouring tons of money into connecting local and rural areas just as much as connecting the big ones. They do this via roads, but they also build like little canals around falls or something, or little ways and paths. If you wonder why a lot of our roads in the United States is called, like, I used to live on Junction Way. Like, it's because they used to call a little path between 2 rural areas a way, right? So you're connecting one little area to another area via a way. We get Junction Lane today, or Junction Way today, or lane or drive or anything like that, okay? So you're connecting the big areas, but you're also connecting the small areas. And this is kind of a convoluted graphic. I apologize. It's not the easiest thing to make out. But what this does is during the colonial era, the infrastructure, and this is the case in Kenya, this is absolutely the case in India, so the Brits are running this playbook across time, is you have a hub and spoke model. You have a lot of extraction points all over the place. They funnel into one single export place, and out of that export place, they send it far away. But what's interesting is all the little spots around the hub are not connected to each other. They just feed into the point where you send the resources far away. This is the colonial model. This is Rhode Island. This is some work I've done on Rhode Island. Now, what you begin to have after the war is the connection of all those smaller extraction points to each other. So instead of a hub and a spoke model, you start to get a web. So the question then is, why does this matter? Well, because they're also doing it by sea. I won't go into this table, but essentially the point is virtually all of the shipping capacity in the colonies was what we call blue water capacity, which means you're going out into the open ocean, you're either going to Great Britain or you're going to the West Indies. There was almost, I mean this quite literally, there was virtually no coastal shipping capacity or river-based shipping capacity in the colonies at all. That changes profoundly after the revolution. Now, I think this is cool. You may not. It's okay. But what I'm going to show you is an example of what this quite literally looks like. So I'm going to use Philadelphia, which Nick has not been to, and he needs to do so. Ha! We were talking about this at breakfast this morning. I'm going to use Philadelphia as a case study. But the The population of Philadelphia between 1776 and 1796 grows by about 50%, but the total like shipping infrastructure in Philadelphia grows by well over 100%. So the basic point is it's growing faster than the population. Now, this is two maps of Philadelphia. The one on the left is created in 1776, so the year of the Revolution. The one on the right is created in 1796, so 20 years later, okay? This middle strip was always heavily used, and this is where most of like the oceanic or the blue water shipping tended to leave from. If you look at the boxes on the bottom and the top, they're pretty sparse. So what I did is you can see these maps like super in close-up. So this middle part, if you look, this middle part is what was used to actually ship across big oceans. And you can see that there's an increase in the number of wharves on this, but it's just from like 7 to 10. That's a 42.9% increase, but that's essentially moving in line with the population. So it's not really doing much of anything. Okay, it looks pretty much the same. If you look at this, which is the northern part of the city, the northern coast of the river, like it is, the number of wharves has grown 214%. And virtually all of these are dedicated to intercolonial trade. Same thing with this on the south side of Philadelphia. You can see it. It looks different. Like you can see that it actually looks different. And that on the south side, it grew, the number of wharves grew 145%. My point is, I like maps. I have the map on the right hanging like 5 feet wide in my office. So I think maps are cool. But the simple point is here that they start building connections, seaborne connections to the other colonies in leaps and bounds after the revolution. The blue water capacity effectively stays the same, but they start building like crazy capacity to trade within the colonies themselves. So they build a domestic market. You're saying, okay, that's great, Scott. Congratulations. Like, why should we care? This is a famous quote. Does anybody by chance know who wrote this? No, Ryan. Anybody besides Ryan know who this is? All right, Ryan, who's it? This is Adam Smith. Very good. The father of modern capitalism. He said, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. What that means is your ability to specialize and become more productive is inherently limited by how many people you can sell to. You're not going to become more productive and produce a lot of things if you can't sell them to people, right? So the fact that they are building this dense integrated domestic market allows then people to specialize, to become more productive, to become more profitable, and then to invest in things that will allow them to do so. So what you see here is a boom in capital investment after this network begins to come together. This is work done by a friend of mine named Frank Garman at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. And he essentially went and looked at like, what you're essentially seeing here is like manufacturing facilities boomed after this period. People invested in productive capacity. They also, how many of you have been to George Washington's Mount Vernon in Virginia, right outside of DC? All right, that's okay. You should all go. If you go to DC, it's awesome. But what George Washington did in the last few years of his life is he invested massive amounts of money in becoming the biggest distilled spirits producer in the United States. And they do this today at Mount Vernon. They actually produce very good whiskey, actually, using the old methods for whatever. But he invested a ton of money in this production capacity. But he only did this a few years before his death in 1799. The question people ask is why? Why didn't George Washington, who was a very savvy businessman, do this earlier? The reason is because he had no market to sell it to. He says this once. If your roads from Mount Vernon to Alexandria, much less to Baltimore, Philadelphia, are impassable, why would you invest in creating all this to produce a lot more whiskey? You wouldn't. But because this network had developed where he could actually distribute this whiskey around the new United States, he invested tens of thousands of dollars at the time, which is a massive amount, and actually becomes a very profitable producer. Unfortunately, he died just a few years later. But nonetheless, you see this boom in capital investment because the market allows it. You start to see specialization in the firm. So firms start to specialize in different cities and different goods. Because there is coast-wise linkages between them, they can then team up with others and offer better goods at better prices for people all over the world. Because of these linkages, they start becoming, as a result of this, becoming much more sophisticated risk managers. This is actually fascinating. They start building analytics departments within their firms in the 1790s, where they have entire teams of clerks whose job it is to get intel from other places and build effectively statistical models to say, this is what you send to when, to what place, and to whom, during what periods of the year, et cetera, et cetera. So they start building like sophisticated analytics teams and risk management teams, and they start specializing their operations. So this is the letters of a guy named John Delafield in New York, who essentially became the best commercial consultant in New York City for trade with Honduras and Nicaragua. And he knew that market better than anybody. So if there is a merchant in New York who's like, I think I want to go get some mahogany and I want to trade in Nicaragua and Honduras, who do you go? You go to John Delafield, because he's able to get you better insurance, better intel, better prices, better da-da-da-da-da-da, and you have the development of an entire commercial service sector on top of this. And so what does this all mean in the end? I am very proud of these. Again, I'm a very boring person. But most people, going back to the very beginning, have this idea that the American economy in the early days was based on the ability to sell essentially tobacco and cotton overseas. That's what the growth generator was. What you see here is the blue line, the light blue lines are the domestic economy, the orange lines are net exports, and then the dark blue lines are invisible earnings on those exports. And what anybody will see, even if you know nothing about economics, is that the vast majority of the economy is the domestic economy. Much of this would have been inverted during the colonial period. And this is just looking at the net change in GDP. So where is growth coming from during the early Republican years? Again, it varies a little bit, but if you're looking at it on rolling periods to eliminate for volatility, or to compensate for volatility, the vast majority of growth is coming from the domestic economy as well. Okay, so it's not about like just extracting things and sending them far away. It's about building this intensive and domestic system as well. I'd be happy to talk about this more if you have questions. So conclusion, what does this mean? Independence and power, but it did not ensure a productive long-term economy. It wasn't just that we get out from under the thumb of the pesky Brits and then we're like on a glide path to superpowerdom. There were a lot of things that could have gone wrong and very, 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 very nearly did. Okay. America's break with its colonial past was key to its long-term success. This is by no means a given. Actually, you see this with a lot of post-colonial developing economies. Their economic systems 50 years on look remarkably similar to the structure of how they were when they were still colonies. And this is understandable. It's like, it's what people know, it's what the systems are designed for, it's how the infrastructure is built. There's absolutely no blame for that, but that is damaging for long-term developing of potential. So this breakage with the colonial past and the American economy becoming American as opposed to colonial and British was vital. And then finally, the US economic development depended on robust institutions and quality leadership. This is really important. And this is where you guys come in. Because if you don't think that this thing can turn around, I tell you it can. So where you guys have a place as a citizenry is making sure that we have those robust institutions and quality leadership that will ensure that these things that we've talked about are able to continue as opposed to just assuming, as others have done, that our fate as an economic superpower is predestined in our birthright, because it's not. So that's on you guys and me, but you guys, because you're younger and I'll be dead sooner than you. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much, and we'll take some questions.
All right, I'll come around with a microphone for questions.
So I'm just curious, if they had this restriction on trade after the 7 years of war, like it was exploding, did this not catch the attention of the British colonizers, or did they just not care?
Oh, no, they definitely cared. But what essentially happened, this kind of boom after the 7 Years' War, is you see this, there was a reason a revolution came up soon thereafter. Because you started seeing the Americans saying, we want to kind of continue to do this, and British authorities are saying, no, 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 we're going to go back to the way it was before. And so that kind of friction that you would expect, like, starts to build and build and build. And I would argue that a lot of the tension that kind of bursts into revolution, this is certainly the case. This the textbook example. A lot of people think that the famous Boston Tea Party had to do with Americans not wanting to pay their taxes. Sorry, not the case. It was the fact that Americans had been able to, during the 7 Years' War, trade with who they wanted, including of them each other. And then after the war, the British tried to reimpose the status quo ante on them, and they got very mad and threw it all in Boston Harbor. So yes, I would say that there was a lot of tension, and that the revolution was a byproduct of that tension that you would naturally assume. Yeah.
I know you kind of push back on kind of like the Darren Asimoglu
Yeah.
thesis of like the difference between like settler and extractive colonies and like that, but would you still say like the fact that like the America was a settler colony and Britain did kind of still import some of their more better institutions over, kind of contributed its ability to break with its colonial past more than, let's say, some other countries where they kept like more traditional institutions in line and had less settlers and were more extractive?
Yeah, I think there's certainly definitely something to that. I mean, I always say, I think it's a line that I've written somewhere, is we have the French to thank for our independence and the Brits to thank for our institutions. Unfortunately true, because they'll hold it over us for the rest of our freaking existence. But yeah, the fact that we did have those kind of British institutions kind of baked into our DNA unquestionably was helpful. So there was this tension, right, between these kind of very beneficial institutions, both on the political and on the social side. But that comes into conflict and is kind of inherent friction with the idea that you are going to be like extractive colonies as well. So yeah, I would say that there's certainly that does cause a friction, but that was helpful. No doubt about that. I can't keep everything from them as much as I wish we could. Yeah, so the question for those who didn't hear was about the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution and how that helped. They are very, 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 very clear that they are going to the Annapolis Convention, which is the convention designed to reform the Articles of Confederation. It is an economic recovery convention. Like, they are very clear about that. And my argument would be that, well, if the idea of the Constitutional Convention was essentially like Annapolis 2.0, the Constitutional Convention was an economic recovery convention as well. But there is no doubt that a lot of the things that fundamentally changed had these problems in mind. So if you think about the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which was not which essentially says you can't have trade wars between the states, and you're going to streamline like the actual integration of interstate commerce between the states, and the federal government is going to sit as the arbiter between trade conflicts between the states. That is 100% because of this. So in many ways, not in all, but in many ways, the Constitution itself is trying to reform the massive structural problems of them trying to merge from a kind of a colonial economic system of fraction or of faction and division and isolation into something that was much more integrated. And they tried it kind of under the Articles of Confederation, but it did not work. I mean, after I've done some tracking of this, I do not recommend reading law books from like all the colonies during the 1780s. I did this, so you don't have to. You're welcome. But like at least 12 of the 13 colonies had massive trade barriers up against the other states in an independent world, right? The 1780s. And the Constitution is created explicitly to prohibit that kind of thing. Yeah. And that obviously has political dimensions as well, right? Obviously. But I would argue that the economic dimensions are just as powerful.
We can take one more question, and I'll also go back to our first slide. For anyone that didn't get the chance to sign in with the QR code, I'll put that back up.
Sorry, this is a lot of slides, people. Here, you can do this. What's up?
So a major thesis in this whole lecture has been that the extractive structures imposed by the British were a major hindrance to economic growth in first the colonies and then the later United States. Are there any cases of colonies that were less extractive, where one could see that the more integrated structures made economic growth once independence was achieved easier?
Very few. Like the nature of colonialism is extractive. Like it's not completely synonymous, but it's pretty close. And so if you're looking at the British Empire, no, they have no non-extractive colonial arrangements. I mean, the one I was in Norway and Denmark over the summer, and the Norwegians still talk about it all the time. About how the colonial relationship with the Danes was just like purely extractive, right? And the Danes, if you were to ask them, would say it was much more benevolent and institutional. But if you ask the Norwegians, who were the colonized, they will say, oh, no, 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 no. This was a fundamentally one-sided extractive relationship, period. So I'm not a specialist on every single colonial regime, but I cannot think of one that is not at its core fundamentally extractive, even though there is some variation as to the degree of that. But that's what I would say there.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. Thank you again, Dr. Miller, for a great lecture. Thank you, everybody.